Narelle. Kia ora koutou. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Kelly Hughes. Kelly is the Managing Director and Senior Field Technician for ATS Environmental based in the Bay of Plenty here in New Zealand. So for the past 20 years or so, he has been actively involved in restoring fish passage and aquatic habitats as a designer and practitioner in New Zealand, as well as several other countries, and has designed and developed a number of the solutions in fish passage toolboxes now commonly used, and continues to research knowledge gaps. So Kelly is presenting today on managing assets with respect to meeting fish passage requirements. We understand there's many differing thoughts on the topic, and if there's interest from the audience today, we would be keen in facilitating a follow-up panel discussion on the topic. So if you'd like to be involved with this, please contact us, and you can contact EIANZ via the email address supplied during Q&A. So welcome, Kelly. Over to you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Narelle. I too will start with a mihi. Tēnā koutou katoa. Tūrua ki ngā mate, haere, haere, haere atu rā. Ka mihi ki te iwi kāinga ki a Ngāti Awa, ki a whakatohia, ki a ngai tūhoi. Ka mihi ki ngā iwi o Aotearoa, ki a tātou e tau nei, ki a ora, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So that too is just acknowledging the people who've gone before, the people of the land, my local tribal areas, and all the tribes or iwi of New Zealand. So without further ado, let's start the ball rolling. Okay. So welcome to you wherever you are, and be aware that this presentation is not specific to New Zealand at all, although most of the material emanates from here. Recent times have seen an improved communication between, and collaboration across engineering and ecology, trying to do better in the fish passage space. For my part, I walk a path between engineering and ecology, speaking both languages. But I'm not here to tell you how you must do things. Today, I wish to share what can be and is already being done to reconnect waterways transected by infrastructure networks. Road culverts are the most common barrier, as a rough estimate, there are over 1 million culverts just here in New Zealand, spread across public and private land. Approximately 50% of those are likely to be barriers to fish by being perched and or high velocity. Very shallow flows through structures can also be a problem for migrating fish. So what's this first slide all about? Well, it's just a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it occurred to us that the traditional approach to fish passage is a bit like getting Michelangelo to paint the Auckland Harbour Bridge, or the Sydney Harbour Bridge, if you like, or the Golden Gate Bridge. It looks nice, a work of art, in fact, but it will cost a fortune, take forever to complete, and won't take any extra vehicles. Today's subject is much bigger than most people realise. The challenge has been what to include and what to leave out, with a focus on upstream migration through or over small structures. There is a network of interconnected subjects. Today, I'm going to take you on a ride on the Fish Passage Express, stopping briefly at each of the following stations: Fish Passage 101, barriers, structure assessment, data management, research, remediation, toolbox, region-wide programs, new builds, guidelines, regulations, monitoring, training, bit of a summary, and some resources. Each of these stops will touch on related elements, but could, in fact, be a session all of its own. Some important messages and themes are repeated along the way. So last time you drove somewhere, for example, on the way to work this morning, did you consider just how many culverts you crossed? Structures and waterways are the intersect of aquatic habitats and human activity. This activity is usually permanent in the form of infrastructure, aiming to add value to the civilized world. Now buckle in, hold on tight, and off we go. Starting with what we call Fish Passage 101. Okay. What are the basic requirements for fish to be able to migrate upstream? Let's keep this simple. We've got to understand what it is that fish need. Clearly, they need sufficient depth. Well, depth in man-made structures is sort of determined by the shape and the gradient and the flow rate. They need continuity. It's no good if there's a break, like with a perched culvert, for example, or somewhere they just simply can't get by. And with depth, of course, the body size and means of locomotion are important considerations. You know, the bigger the fish, the deeper it needs to be, kind of obviously. But also the means of locomotion, how they make their way through the water or along the edges, is important too. Structures that are overhanging or undercut have been long since understood as being barriers to fish. Some climbing species can utilize wetted margins or splash zones if they're present. And as far as velocity goes, in natural waterways, you know, we typically have a really complex flow regime, like the photo on the right, where you've got a mixture of rest pools, different depths, different velocities, back eddies, rest pools, and the like. Fish will choose to navigate the pathway that best suits their particular swimming capabilities. Fast laminar flows, often found in man-made structures, can be a barrier to fish. So what typically inhibits upstream migration? We've all seen perched or overhanging culverts, something like this, to varying degrees of severity. Perched aprons or just vertical, they may not be undercut, but being perched like that is very difficult for most fish to get up. As you can imagine, there isn't even a plunge pool at the base of that one, which actually is part of a gravel trap. You see fast laminar flow. This is probably by far and away the most common issue that to some degree gets forgotten about. We spend a lot of time dealing with perched culverts, but it's actually what's going inside that matters as well. And the good old tide gates of varying forms. Some of which hang by default as closed, and others may or may not be more fish friendly. So while there are other factors, for example, temperature, DO, water quality, predation, lack of cover, etc., let us remind ourselves, you know, that some barriers are there from the day they're installed, and others become a barrier over time. Nature can make things tricky for fish too, okay? But we avoid referring to waterfalls and the like as natural barriers, and thereby an excuse not to do something around it, but rather natural features or natural challenges. This waterfall is over 50 meters high and is technically perched, and we've found fish above that using eDNA. So you're not going to get out of jail just saying, oh, there's a waterfall downstream, we don't need to fix this culvert. It's really what that message is. So if we're going to assess structures, the thousands that are out there, we need some tools to do that. And there's quite a few out there. There is the ATS Structure Assessment Tool. That's an app. We've got the NIWA FPAT, Fish Passage Assessment Tool. There's the RAMS app that a lot of roading authorities use along with some councils to manage their assets. Art Collector, some people use that, but the reality is it doesn't really matter too much which app you use, providing you understand what the whole point of collecting data is. So what is the point? Well, the point is to capture enough information to understand the extent of the problem across a given area, to describe each structure, to determine if it's likely to be a barrier to fish, the suggested remediation, predict the likely cost, detailed planning, meaningful reporting, and other things like being able to report to the asset owner if the structure is in fact in need of maintenance. Usually the process begins with desktop kind of analysis, which creates targets to go out into the field to. Then there's a field assessment, and that can coincide with remediation on the fly, but there are pros and cons with this that we can go into another time. Then remediation, if required, occurs, and then we get into the ongoing monitoring cycle. I have worked with Downer in the Tasman region to modify the RAMS app so that we can hoover up a bit of fish passage that we can later run the algorithms over to see if it's a barrier or not, and what we might do to fix it, and then various other bits and pieces of information. And indeed, if it's already had some remediation work done on it, what the state of repair is of that remediation. Getting back to the RAMS thing, it became very important to consider the cost to the public of doing these assessments. And we were out in the back and beyond of nowhere and assessing culverts, and lo and behold, another ute pulls up with a team assessing the culvert as part of the asset management. And that seemed crazy. We could have done their job or they could have done ours. And that's why we collaborated and looked at what we could do with the RAMS tool as it's being used in many cases on a regular basis. And here's some guys in the south of New Zealand doing it hard, assessing culverts in some pretty grim conditions, but getting on with it all the same. We have a long list of attributes that are collected, their rationale, and the unit of measure, and the format, and that is a whole subject in its own that we're more than happy to talk to at another stage. So now you've got a whole heap of data, what are you going to do with it? These are, as we see more and more of in the world, colourful dots on a map. If this was live HTML, we could click on those dots and you'd see metadata. But what's clear is that we're no longer talking about fixing one culvert here and there. Some territorial authorities, starting with a desktop exercise, now have many thousands of targets at various stages of assessment, remediation, and monitoring. Keeping track of the current status of these structures has seen us work with regional councils, forestry management companies, etc., creating a master data set with various outputs, typically assessed via SharePoint. So we start, out in the field. We've got the data using an app or whatever. That comes in to the FTP. It's uploaded. We don't usually do it out in the field. It's generally a bit more stable to do it when you're in good Wi-Fi coverage. The data is then polished in a CSV exported. And we have our first little technical, okay. Then we've now got a master data set, and data can be brought into that from other data sets, or indeed exported to other data sets. Then we write the reports based on the current status, recommended fixes, estimated costs, maps with metadata, detailed PDFs, and work parcels with materials and field maps. This is typical of the sort of graph that might be put out, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. It's the Sankey, but you can do your pie graphs or whatever you want, just to break down where things are at. Again, if this was HTML, I could be mousing over the various elements and it would give me some numbers. This is the table, the current table of the current status that is allocated to any given structure once it's assessed, and that changes as it progresses. I won't get into too much detail, but you can see they're in groups starting with where they haven't been assessed. It's simply a desktop target that's been created by various means that we can go into another time. Then the ones are basically not barriers. The twos are ones that have been remediated. The threes are ones that need maintenance, either the structure or the fish passage. The fours are currently barriers by various means. The 5 is a temporary barrier. There's a reason behind that. The 6s are basically a lack of data because not enough was collected on the app due to accessibility, or it was some old data that was dragged into the data set. 7 is a natural feature that may be picked up during a stream walk as opposed to down the highways. And number 8 are basically acknowledging areas or structures that are where there is doubtful fish habitat upstream. So this is how it kind of flows. What we start with a desktop survey, then field assessment, then assign a status, and depending on that status, the next action is triggered. It can be to advise the asset owner if it needs work, or we talk to the client about a suggested fix. And remember, the whole point of this is we can be dealing with hundreds or thousands of sites at a time, not just the old one at a time here and there. So we have systems that are all set up to enable this to happen and automatically generate a range of reports. Moving on to research, which a lot of people are aware of is an ongoing process. A lot of research has been done over the years in the lab. Lab trials are often favoured because it's a fairly robust, controlled environment. Unfortunately, it's not natural for the fish and they don't always behave on cue. But in the interest of repeatable science, it can be better than nothing and highlights some extremes. Then, ideally, we do field research. The problem with field research, of course, is it's pretty hard to repeat. Now, the research helps us understand the client, the fish, and also helps develop optimized tools. But with greater experience now and looking through a fresh lens, we are learning that some historical research is lacking and some historical trials misinterpreted or misreported. Some trials are okay in the lab, but others do need to be in the field. Given the range of structures with various diameters, gradients, lengths, flow rates, etc., coupled with the different swimming or climbing abilities of fish, along with rain events, seasonal and lunar cycles, meaningful trials, in other words, ones that we have confidence in, are a real challenge. Backy trials, for example, it's very difficult to find 2 culverts the same. And if you're doing before and after, how much after, what's the time space between before and after? So the temporal scale becomes a bit of an issue. In the Tasman region, late last year, a 4-week-long study was done to look at a pair of matching culverts, these ones in the photo, just to gauge the effects of some rampants and baffles. And still more learning was done there, just in the way the fish behaved when the nets were up there or not. It seemed to affect what was going on right through the culvert. So we need to learn a lot more in the monitoring or research space. Also down the west coast of New Zealand, there's a trial about to begin looking at some different baffles. That's going to be interesting. We've done a lot of work using CFD, computational fluid dynamic modeling. And it's been really interesting because even looking at that image, you'll see there's some very intricate changes in flow across and down through the water column that we don't have instruments that are capable of measuring that with any degree of accuracy, yet that's exactly where the fish have evolved to migrate and find the path of least resistance, for want of a better term. Understanding what fish are actually capable of out in the environment by reverse engineering structures and natural features where fish have been found above would be most useful. However, there are other knowledge gaps that would be useful to better understand. I'll just run through some of these, and these are just sort of some throwaway ones. I'm sure everybody out there is aware of some other knowledge gaps that it would be great to better understand. So what are the consequences for fish of having to navigate challenging structures? Do they expend too much energy to then reach their spawning ground if it's a salmon, for example? Or are they too tired to avoid the resident predator that's waiting upstream, be it a fish like an eel or a heron standing on the rock? Under what conditions do climbing species transition from swimming to climbing? How quickly do fish move up through natural waterways, even if there isn't a structure? If you've got a reach that's 50 meters long, how long do we expect fish to take to get from one end to the other to thereby be able to gauge the effectiveness of remediation through a similar length structure. What are the ideal configurations of interventions across various structures? For example, baffle spacing. Still plenty to be learned there. Under what flow conditions do various species typically move upstream? We hear people often say, oh, they don't move during high flows. Well, really, who's checking that? Or they only move during very low flows. Well, I think we need to do a bit more there. And is it different across species? I imagine what happens up in North Queensland is quite different in a tropical climate to what might happen in a subtropical climate or south of New Zealand. How long does it take to repopulate the ideal balance of species upstream once a barrier is remediated? This is quite important because if we're doing monitoring after some remediation, how soon after should that be done? And a whole heap of fish might have gone up, but if you do if they're juveniles, moving into an area already populated by a few adults, there's a pretty good chance that a fair few of them will be consumed by the end of the summer or whenever you may choose to do your monitoring. So we're looking at artificial intelligence with downward-looking cameras and things to maybe monitor what's coming out the end of a culvert, for example. How does in-stream vegetation help with upstream migration? There's been very little work done on this, and we think it's really important because we find fish in places they shouldn't be, primarily in places where there's a goodly amount of in-stream vegetation. It seems fairly obvious that it has an impact on the flow dynamics, but there's also temperature and cover, refuge and the like for fish to inch their way up. Be neat to know how that works. How do fish navigate riprap type erosion control, particularly when the water is subsurface? We see a few examples of this, and we'd just be interested to know, is it good, bad, or indifferent? And maybe it heals over time and it's all good to go, but it is a knowledge gap. So let's move into new builds. Another big subject that you could spend probably a couple of days on. So I'm just going to cherry pick a little bit on this one. Obviously, there's the standard considerations like the purpose of why you're building it, the capacity over time, population growth, more traffic, wider roads, and climate change. Then we've got cultural considerations, life expectancy, environmental impact, carbon footprint of the materials in the installation process, erosion control, which also fits into ecological impact, the migration of aquatic and other organisms, including terrestrial. Our American friends are pretty quick to tell us we've got to worry about getting through turtles and bears and mountain lions and things. They all make use of culverts as well to get under a highway or up a stream. So that shouldn't be forgotten. And of course, cost. Now, whichever format is chosen, there's still some key considerations at the design stage. Is it possible to reroute? Is a bridge better? What are the options for culverts, bottomless, stream simulation, artificial bed material, backwatering, etc.? At worst, we probably want to match or better the hydrological characteristics of the stream, particularly upstream characteristics. What outcome are we trying to achieve? Usually it's as simple as the local varieties of fish want to move upstream, and they can do so in their own time, navigating a route that best suits their particular swimming abilities. Mitigation in the form of baffles can retain suitable bed material retention at challenging sites. If you're stuck on bedrock, for example, or a very steep site where you're going to struggle, for the most part, to be able to retain bed material. Bed material retention is a great thing that we do strive for. An important note is that there have been studies, I think it was University of Wisconsin, that show that the life expectancy of structures can be significantly extended if the structure is embedded or fitted with flexible baffles, thereby reducing abrasion and corrosion. A well-installed fish-friendly culvert will typically have a lower exit velocity and require less downstream erosion control, and studies have been done on that as well. So we're talking about remediation now of existing structures. So let's look at the remediation toolbox. There's always room for innovation and improvement, and when we're looking at tools in the toolbox, and comparing different options, we need to be pretty clear on what those criteria are. And the deeper we got into this, the more we discovered there's actually a lot of criteria that can be weighted and to form a matrix for scoring the various attributes that we would like to consider when choosing one form of remediation over another. So first and foremost is what everyone probably sees as quite obvious, is the ecology. So does the intervention or the tool suit all species in low flow and base flow and high flow? And what about fish sizes in low flow, base flow, high flow? Does it in fact create in-stream habitat? Does it retain substrate or bed material? Is it not a further barrier to fish? Is it likely to cause injuries to fish? Hydrology. So now we can start looking at the actual water. Does it reduce the velocity? Does it increase the overall depth? Does it provide low velocity zones? Does it provide resting pools? And does it induce complex flow? From an engineering perspective, we've got to think about, does it have minimal impact on the capacity? Is it likely to cause debris jams? Is it durable in floods? Are you still going to be able to put your CCTV camera through? Are you going to be able to put a hydrojet through? These are nothing to do with fish, but are absolutely important when considering what is fit for purpose in terms of intervention. I'm just zooming. As far as the installation goes, that is also an important consideration. Can the intervention that you're contemplating suit all types of culverts? Can it suit multiple culvert sizes or other structures? Can it be retrofitted to live culverts, or are you going to have to pump it dry? We are lucky, we very rarely have to involve pumps in what we do. Can it be retrofitted or should it be retrofitted to dry culverts, maybe before they even go into the ground, in the case of new ones? Is it versatile and adaptable? Can you do stuff on site to say, actually, I need this to be a bit longer, a bit shorter, cut a bit out here, or modify it to suit that particular site? And what is the labour cost per metre of structure for this particular intervention? Other considerations are, of course, the overall life expectancy. Is it recycled, or can it be recycled? Sorry, is it made from recycled material, or can it be recycled at end of life? What is the material cost per metre of the structure? And looking perhaps broader, how has this intervention been uptake? What is the uptake? Are lots of people using this, or is it a bit rare? And that's often an indication as to the effectiveness or suitability. So let's look at some actual fixes, which is probably what a lot of people came to this webinar for, but it is really just a small part of the big subject. So we talked about perch structures, and we typically fix these structures with either soft ramps, floating ramps, or looped muscle rope. And that's an example of a short floating ramp with some muscle rope. I think you can see some baffles up through the pipe as well. Velocity barriers. Well, what can we do about that? Well, you can backwater them. Sometimes, historically, it was quite common to try and put in downstream weirs, but they were often involved heavy equipment or concrete, and often didn't last the season, were quite expensive, or in themselves became a barrier to fish, but they are still absolutely an option. You can use flexible baffles to create backwatering effects. And if it's a very small culvert, you've got no other option, you might be able to put some muscle rope through. Here's an example of a long straight culvert with some baffles, and you can see some bed material starting to accumulate in there. Low flows, again, you can backwater to create a bit of depth. You can use flexible baffles there as well, or you could create low flow swim channels by various means. Here's an example here of backwatering where some rocks have been put downstream to try and get some water back into the mouth of that culvert. Tide gates, unfortunately, often can be expensive fixes. Not as bad as it used to be. It's not an all-out replacement. We're still doing some work in that space to make it ever more practical or adjustable and risk-free. And we're seeing more and more where management is a go-to tool in the first instance, where gates are simply held open for as long as possible, days or weeks or months at a time, and only closed when there is a threat of a rain event. But you can have mechanisms that can delay the closing of the tide gate on each incoming tide. And these can be cantilevers or offset top hinge. And there's been a few other attempts with floats and things out there that have pros and cons. Okay. There's an example of a cantilever on a fairly average size flap gate. Region-wide programs. This to me is sort of the nitty-gritty in terms of shifting that focus from ones and twos. It's a big picture management strategy. There's currently a handful of region-wide assessment and remediation programs underway here in New Zealand. This is the Bay of Plenty region where I live. The fact that we now have effective low-cost and low-impact remediation tools that can be pretty much put in all year round, actually, along with streamlined data management, we have made it possible to have region-wide programs, to make them feasible. Prioritization now looks more like choosing which catchment or highway, as opposed to the protracted exercise of choosing one culvert over another, based on a spurious scoring system. Greater Wellington here in New Zealand is leading a forum of councils, I believe, embarking on programs in order to share experiences and resources at that regional level. Some of the challenges, though, are just simply managing big data. And the other challenge is having skilled assessors and practitioners, the continuity of work for contractors. In some countries, the consent or permit process can be a real roadblock, but don't let bureaucracy and processes get in the way. These can be overcome if there is a genuine willingness to do so. This here, you won't be able to see the detail almost deliberately because it's too much to go over today, but this is a mind map of a regional strategy touching on all of the different facets, the different stakeholders, departments within different organisations and how it all interconnects. I'm happy to share that and go over it at another stage in much more detail. So now, the next subject for us is guidelines. To their credit, guidelines have, in their advocacy role, gone a long way to bring about an awareness of the issues surrounding fish passage. In the fish passage space, there are various guidelines produced by central and local government and industry, like forestry and roading. They have their own guidelines that they have produced over the years. But who trumps who? And does that matter if the focus is on the outcome? In other words, effective fish passage, however you want to talk about it. What is the point of guidelines? Well, as we said, bring about an awareness of an issue, highlight regulations relating to the issue, and document the desired outcomes. And so what should guidelines be? Well, I think they should be a collaborative resource for all stakeholders. They should be easy to read, and they should absolutely be updated regularly. What they should not be is prescriptive, broad brush, in other words, one size fits all, or a regulatory tick box. A bit more on guidelines. We couldn't put it all onto one slide. So we have seen situations where guidelines have, through the legislative process, become regulatory, yet in many cases are unworkable. This diagram shows what is typical of what we unfortunately encounter on an almost daily basis. When guidelines are over-prescriptive, they're almost immediately out of date, as they are unable to embrace advances in technology, the current state of knowledge, and evolving methodologies. Asset owners are unable to meet the criteria for the permitted activity, which is often regulations stating in accordance with whatever guidelines that they want to make the conditions or the regulations to be in accordance with. So 9 times out of 10, the permitted activity is unachievable. So the asset owner or prospective owner can go down one of two pathways. They can go down the consent pathway having not been able to achieve, through the consent process and negotiate more favourable conditions that are more often than not accepted by an experienced consenting staff who just simply haven't had the experience in the fish passage space to know what's good, bad, or otherwise, and often ends in poor outcomes for fish. Or they take the second route, which is just simply non-engagement, and that has poor outcomes for fish. This is well accepted as being almost the default setting in many regions, to sort of see what you can get away with, and it's often easier to ask for forgiveness than it is to ask for permission. Regulations. Well, there are a lot of regulations out there. There's at least 4 or 5 in New Zealand relating to fish passage, and you'll be aware of the ones in your particular region or country. In many cases, the hierarchy of these regulations is unclear. And now the challenge is to determine where on the landscape the rules apply. Presumably, there must be suitable fish habitat above the structure. So when do you fix a dry culvert? There are cases when you might. And when do you not fix wet ones? Well, there's a few of those cases as well. Who determines this, and how is it determined? Is it fair or realistic to expect the asset owner to undertake an ecological survey above each and every structure where there is doubt? Can we collectively develop a decision tree or metric to determine that? Who's currently paying for surveys and remediation? Who should pay going forward? Some local authorities are issuing abatement notices. Is this approach working? More guidance is absolutely needed in these areas if we want to be confident in enforcement. Monitoring. Monitoring is a tricky one, because if regulations are to be enforced, there needs to be a level playing field backed up by fair and reasonable monitoring. What are the measures of success? What is a pass or a fail? Very little guidance in that space. How long should fish take to navigate a structure based on its gradient, flow rate, and length? If there are interventions that are a little bit novel in some respect, but still have the same outcome, do we need to do a monitoring on each and every one of those, or can we take a snapshot or cross-section and move with some confidence? And what tools have we got to actually do the monitoring? Well, there's a traditional mark and recapture, eDNA, not so traditional, but it's becoming more favourable simply because it has its own quirks. Trapping and spotlighting. There are other indicators, of course, like the retention of bed material in itself, which is a pretty good indicator that a culvert in particular is unlikely to be a barrier to fish. Or can we look at a complexity of flow index? Because measuring water is another way of gauging success. However, it is very difficult to measure accurately across and down through the water column, particularly in small flows and at a meaningful resolution. And please note that average velocity is misleading and meaningless to fish. Other indicators that can be measured or observed with some degree of accuracy or consistency are going back to depth. It's not hard to measure the depth or a range of depths with a ruler. Bed material retention, as I mentioned, it either is or isn't there, or may partly not be there. But I think we would all agree if we're staring at a culvert, whether it was or not. And something we've been chipping away at is a complexity of flow index, which would help to determine if remediation or mitigation has resulted in the structure being improved and or matching the stream, thereby catered to the migrational needs of the fish present. In an ideal world, an ecologist, an engineer, and compliance officer would all agree on the score. I've been working on this and would cheerfully take input from this audience and EIANZ, and that could be quite a fun workshop to do. The image on the right just shows that really what we're talking about is navigability, and that is a factor of the gradient, length, and velocity, the volume, and irregular elements creating complexity that hopefully gives fish the opportunities they need. Training. Okay. With the training, we have got a real challenge in being able to have enough work in front of people for them to invest in the health and safety, the vehicle, the equipment, the insurance. So by having these region-wide programs, which may be funded from different avenues, can still be coordinated so that you have a team of competent, trained people out on the ground doing the work on an almost daily basis. We've tried to help a little bit by training people ourselves and sending them off to the South Island, and we've helped in the the bottom of the South Island, the top of the South Island. We helped with Horizon train their in-house people who are now making real progress. And here in the Bay of Plenty, we've done quite a bit as well. I've run a few workshops in Taranaki and the like, and in the Hawke's Bay. But it's something we can do a heck of a lot better on. And we've sort of getting our ducks in a row. And Ecology have put together a fish passage training manual, which is absolutely updated as and when required. It's a living document. It contains a whole lot of tricks and traps and things for young players. There is still some guidance to be had with respect to new builds, but I think that needs to be revisited. We share a lot of experience through the Fish Passage Action Team mail-outs on a fairly irregular basis, but probably 1 or 2 a month, where we share stories, videos, whatever. There's a lessons learned format that could be a much better tool than it currently is. We're just sharing interesting stuff so that people don't make the same mistake, or if somebody has a great idea on how to do something, we can share that. Oh, and we're just in the middle of a pretty decent earthquake here. Bear with. Oh, okay. Right. Another thing I've been asked about is certification. And I think we're not far away from being able to deliver in that space. And it would be another great thing to work alongside EIANZ and regional councils, where we could perhaps host 1 or 2 day workshops focused on some theory and some practical elements. But again, that's something that we can talk about into the future. So we want some take-home messages, okay? As I said, the previous topics could be a webinar on their own. Around the world, the traditional dogmatic approach to remediating barriers to fish passage was based on limited awareness, limited funding, limited remediation options, thin science, no reliable monitoring or enforcement tools, and pushback from engineers. The outcome from this has typically seen very few barriers remediated and a disproportionate share of the funding spent on prioritization and playing God by focusing on target species. The new narrative is based on much greater public awareness and mandates to do better, significantly more funding, proven low impact, low cost remediation tools, catchment or region-wide remediation program addressing hundreds, if not thousands, of structures. So, complex flows should be provided as they have a range of depths and velocities similar to natural streams. I think we've said that a few times. Guidelines are just that, guidelines, and each site needs to be treated according to its particular characteristics. Guidelines and training manuals must be updated regularly. Local government needs to commit to training and provide continuity of work for practitioners. With the current toolbox, there is no longer any excuse for not getting on with it. Time is not our friend when reconnecting waterways and repopulating habitats. Now, the next slide is just a list of some resources that we can share as and when. We've put together a video library. So instead of fumbling around on YouTube and on our own Dropbox folders and things, we've created a document that lists the videos, whether you can click on them, a hyperlink, and what they're all about, what the content is. We are building a CFD library that works in a similar way, so we can drill in and find a culvert of a similar diameter or length or flow rate, gradient, and look at the CFD work that's been done, and any more work will be pushed into that. There's lessons learned, there's some on the doc site and some on the ATS site, and that needs a bit of a push. There's some before and after examples, which people are really keen to get their hands on. So it shows some of the typical barriers and what has been done or can be done to fix them. On the website, there's the interactive decision tree where you follow your nose through a process that leads you to a suggested solution for a particular culvert or structure. There's the Fish Passage Training Manual 2022, which we are looking at sharing. There's that Fish Passage Management Strategy mind map that I talked about. And there are various case studies which have been done to show the effectiveness in the field of some interventions. So we have more resources than I have time to share with you today. So just please contact me directly if you want anything in particular. Short of that, I think we've just about got time to thank the Fish Passage Action Team, ATS Environmental, Oil Ecology Limited, and of course, EIANZ. And I'm good to go as far as any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Kelly. I just had a check on GeoNet. You went through a 4.7 earthquake 20 kilometres north of Opotiki. So not too big, but enough. It was 20 kilometres deep. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, 56 kilometres deep.
Okay. Yeah. Out towards White Island, I'm picking.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, the window certainly rattled. Well, I think I was too rattled, but the windows did.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Yeah. So we've got a few questions here.
Yep.
And just put up with my croaky voice that keeps coming in and out. I'll just start reading out a few, if you don't mind, addressing them. So the first one is, it's come in as anonymous, and it says, when you mentioned that having the nets at the end of the culvert influenced what was going through the culvert, could you please elaborate on what you mean?
Yeah, I wasn't on that site. It was Tim Ollie, and it was quite simple, really. The nets were set up for a month, and one with and one without baffles, and they had a ramp as well. And what was observed, and Tim will put me right, was that over the course of that month, fish were observed within the structure, yet when the nets were taken away, they moved right through. So whether they'd gone up to the nets and come back, or were aware of something affecting the hydrology upstream that made them less inclined to move, which is not remarkable, but it makes it very difficult in the science space to explain these things. I hope that helps.
Thank you. There's another question here. We don't have who it's from, but in New Zealand, are baffles used on the sidewalls as well as on the culvert inverts?
Not so much, but they certainly are in Australia. In Australia, you've got a lot more box culverts, and the box culverts are actually the preferred option generally based on some studies that were done by DAF, but they are now seeing that there's a need to address bed material retention and create rest pools, and you don't get that with side baffles. That's not to say that you can't have both. With round culverts, basically, it's a question of how far up the walls you extend the baffle all in one piece to achieve what you would. So it's really about, in those bigger flows, have you got resident species that are likely to want to make their way through in high flows. In New Zealand, the high flows are pretty short-lived, and the fish are very, very small. So they can wait 24 hours and make their way up when the flows are reduced, taking advantage of whatever's been done to help them with a complex flow. Is my slant on it anyway. Okay.
Yeah, we've got one here from Peter. I am interested to hear your comment in regards to why so many fish passage solutions are plastic poly products and are photodegradable and not biodegradable, meaning these will generate microplastic, which obviously is a problem to fish, such as mussel ropes, spat ropes, are made
Okay.
from. Yeah.
This is a question that we ask ourselves more than anybody else. Okay, we're out there doing this every day, but there's no natural fibre that's going to last long enough to make it economically viable, unfortunately, unless you want to go back every 3 to 6 months to put in more rope. The baffles that we make are not photodegradable, they're photostable and do not break down into microplastics. They are in themselves, they have a percentage of reground material, and at end of life, they can absolutely be reground. These are all the sort of things we ask ourselves as a developer in the fish passage space on a daily basis. And if somebody's got a better solution to make rope or a flexible, robust product that can take a hit in a flood event, then please let me know. Okay.
All right. Does New Zealand have predominantly demersal species, as during high flow events, solely having bed material would not necessarily mean that the culvert is not a barrier if the velocities are too high?
Well, hang on, I've got to reinterpret that. Does New Zealand have as during high flow events, solely having bed material is not actually that. What you find is that if there's nothing like baffles in there, that that bed material will be swept out in what we would consider a high flow event. If that bed material is retained during a full cycle of events or most events, then we'd be fairly confident that it's not a barrier to fish. And as I was relating to that other question, the high flow events are so short-lived, it doesn't matter in New Zealand. I know if you'd only had rain once a year in Queensland and it was a tropical storm, the fish have got to try and get through and take advantage of that, maybe at the beginning or end of it. So a little bit of horses for courses there, but no, bed material retention is a really important consideration in determining whether a barrier is a structure is a likely barrier to fish or not during normal flows.
All right, we've got one from Julie. Does the amount of light within structures have an impact on the success for fish passage? Should fish windows be introduced for longer passageways? I'm
not an expert on this, but I have read that people have done studies and it was inconclusive as to whether or not it mattered about light. We see plenty of fish within culverts hanging out, for want of a better term, but whether they're disinclined to move or not move based on how big and how long the culvert is and thereby how much light gets into it. Wearing another hat, I did provide some specialised manhole grates for a project that they wanted to be able to daylight a long culvert, but I never heard if it made an iota of difference or not. Fish generally don't like being in direct sunlight by and large and would seek refuge in the shade. So I don't see unless it was absolutely pitch black, I don't really see too much of an issue there, but it's a good discussion point.
Thank you. I'm not going to be able to get through everybody's questions, so I apologise now. There's one from Treff Barnett. Any ideas on how to address very long, steep culverts under new motorways, for example, Transition Gully or Huhoi to Warkworth?
Yes, the first thing is to talk to us before you design it. We so often see ad hoc mitigation for new structures, where if we'd had a discussion prior to, it would have been a heck of a lot easier to do stuff. Because depending on the diameter of a culvert, for example, if it's under 750 mil, you don't really want to go and put stuff in it after the fact. So, but you've got every opportunity to insert things as the pipes are installed or before they're installed. I have done that in Auckland. You know, it was like a train wreck of culverts on the site, and we went through and put baffles 600 mil in from each end. And so when they're all put together, they were 1,200 mil apart. Now these were in concrete 240 mil. or 2,400 millimeter culverts, 2.4 meters. But yeah, it's about talking to people before you bury your pipes, basically, or before you even get consent, because there's often an excuse used that if they've already got a consent, they can't change the design. And so something inappropriate happens. Okay.
Look, I think there's only time for one more. So you have your contact details, were they on the webinar? On your presentation?
No, they were not.
Really
We should have.
Okay.
Yeah, they can get through you, or it's just go to ats-environmental.com.
Yeah. I'll ask one more anyway, and it's from Libby. What do you suggest for a site that does not have information about what species are present, but they want to improve a barrier? Can they do a best guess option or wait till they have the species?
That is really the best question. That's what a lot of my point of my discussion was around. If you focus on matching or bettering the upstream characteristics, then it doesn't really matter which species you're talking about. Whoever's downstream will get upstream and be able to progress further. So you look at how deep it is, that how complex the flow is. And if you're able to match that and it's not overhanging or perched, they can get into the culvert, if it's the culvert you're talking about, and it matches or better the upstream. By matching or better, I mean deeper than, maybe wider than, better rest pools, more complexity than. And you would have heard me use complexity a lot, and we use that because some people get fixated with turbulence, and we don't use the term turbulence because it has negative connotations where the human eye focuses on the higher velocity zones, where if you talk about complexity of flow, you're drawn to look at all of the dynamics across and down through the water column. And that's what you're trying to achieve. It is honestly less about fish. It's about fluid dynamics. I hope that helps.
Okay, well, the hour is up now. So yeah, let us know. Sorry that we couldn't get through all your questions. But yeah, like I said earlier, if you're passionate about the subject and you'd like to, you know, give your opinions or have great ideas to share, we are quite keen to facilitate some sort of panel discussion. So yeah, on the chat there was right at the start a email for EIANZ. So I think that's it, Narelle.
Yep, that's correct. We'll send the link once it's converted to everybody for the recording.
Okay. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Okay, we'll keep in touch.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
A reminder, if anyone has any comments that they want to make or be part of the panel session, please contact us at office@eianz.org. That's OFFICE@eianz.org. Thanks and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.